let's go ahead then. What are we up to? What are our main ideas? In other words, what are our objectives? Can you see that? Yeah? Okay. If you're having trouble seeing it at the back, maybe come to the front. Other people seem to be having seen it all right. As I say, I will get the tech guys to come and take a look and find out what's going on. Okay, objectives for today. Basically, we're focusing on growth. Okay? So we want to define what that means. We want to calculate it. And we want to see what are the implications. Why are we interested in growth? Why is it important? That's the first bit. Secondly, what else? We're going to talk about growth trends. Okay, in other words, what has growth been doing over time? We will focus on South Africa. There is a brief discussion in your chapter about other countries as well. Our focus won't really be on other countries. We'll just look at South Africa primarily. Now, inputs into production are capital and labor. Those are our primary inputs. So what we're going to look at is how population growth, as well as the productivity of labor, how those two things feed into GDP growth. We're going to also try and understand what are the sources of productivity. In other words, how does labor become more productive? Finally, discuss some of the different kinds of theories about economic growth, and then look at some of the evidence. And hopefully we'll be able to get through all of that today. Again, just interrupt me if you think it's time for a break and I'm not watching the time. So GDP, why are we interested in GDP? Because GDP is it's like a proxy measure for how well we are doing. So if GDP is growing, on average, that means people in the economy are doing better. Their standard of living is improving in general. So if we have rapid economic growth over a number of years, in other words, we have our GDP increasing consistently, we're likely to transform our nation from a poor nation to a rich nation. Being a rich nation is a summary for saying one in which our standard of living is better. The opposite of that, obviously, if you've got slow growth, then you're going to be doing the reverse. What do we mean by growth? Growth, normal story, growth rate, GDP in the current year minus the previous year divided by the previous year. In other words, the normal growth equation is just a percentage change equation, right? So it's new minus old over old, okay? Calculating inflation. Inflation is a growth rate in prices. GDP growth rate. Any kind of growth rate is just a percentage change that's going to have the same formula. Whenever we're talking about growth rates, why a rate of growth is important, why sustained growth is important, is because it has a compounding effect. So if you're 5% and then that 5% grows by an additional 5%, then that additional 5% grows by an additional 5%, you get the compounding effect. I think I mentioned briefly last week, or maybe I didn't mention the rule of 70, but the rule of 70 is like a quick way of calculating a growth rate. What you do is you say, okay, well, what the rule of 70 is if you take the number of years, it will give you, the rule of 70 gives you the number of years that it takes for something, the level of something to double. The way you do it is you just divide the number 70 by whatever the growth rate is. Okay, so let me give you an example of what that means. So time taken for something to double is equal to 70 divided by interest rate. Okay? I'll get with you in a sec. So in other words, if I'm looking at the time taken for something to double, and that time is 10 What does that tell you the interest rate was on average over that period? 70 divided by what equals 10? 7. Okay? In other words, what that tells you is over those 10 years, the interest rate or the GDP growth rate was approximately 7%. Yeah, sorry. Yeah? Okay, color, does everyone want that? It's just not working today. Okay, does red work? Does that arrow look better in red? No. Does it look better in green? Okay. So you happy with green today? Yeah? Okay. As I say, there's something wrong with the with this projector thing today. I don't know what it is, but obviously red and stuff like that is just not working. Okay, that's weird. Okay, so T. So if we're looking at a period of 10 years, and in 10 years, our interest rate our GDP doubled in 10 years, that means that the growth rate over that period was 7%. So last week, when we were looking at the inflation numbers, and I was looking at how long in 10-year periods of time, like whether how the price level was changing on average, that allows you to calculate an average interest rate. Where does this come from? For those of you that are interested, basically, if you're going to look at something that's growing continuously, then your calculation would be E is to the RT gives you continuous growth. So if you've got something, say prices are growing continuously, you want to know how long does it take for P to become 2P? So we can divide P's. You got E to the RT equals 2. Take lins of both sides. You got RT equals ln 2. In other words, T is equal to, now ln of 2 is approximately 0.7. So 0.7 divided by R equals T. Okay? So if T was 10, 0.7 divided by 0.07 equals 10. In other words, 0.07 would be 7%. So 70 divided by 7% equals 10. 0.7 divided by 0.07 equals 10. R 0.07, that is your interest rate. Cool. I know it doesn't look like it, but that's actually green, which is weird. Okay. So that's the rule of 70. It's basically just like a back of napkin calculation for working out interest rates. What does our growth look like in South Africa over the last couple of decades? Sorry. We've plotted here South Africa, comparing it to, say, Mauritius, Botswana, and Namibia. Our growth doesn't look that impressive compared to Botswana or Mauritius. What about other high-income countries like the United States, the Euro? Well, here's South Africa, and here's the world as an average. South Africa's not looking that great. It's kind of looking a lot like what sub-Saharan Africa is looking like, except obviously much higher. So we've got a high growth rate relative to sub-Saharan Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa in general is just not growing very quickly. Sorry, we've got a high growth rate, we've got a high level of GDP relative to sub-Saharan Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa is not growing, and neither are we. The rest of the world is looking pretty good. What do these figures look like? So this is from the Reserve Bank. You'll see that since the 1960s, here's our growth. You can see from 1994, so before 1994, from the 80s to 1994, growth is relatively flat. After 1994, it starts picking up. Then it gets really, really good. This is about 2008, so this is financial crisis, right? Plus Zuma. And you see that the growth rates is kind of, I don't know. We'll see what happens afterwards. I don't have, let's just say I'm wary about what's going to happen to growth in the next couple of years. You'll notice that that the growth rate goes up and down and up and down and up and down. That's a seasonal effect. In other words, here's January, back to January, back to January, back to January, that kind of idea, right? So you can see that the seasons have an effect on GDP throughout the year. If we smooth that out, this is our GDP over time. Again, here's our 90s up to Zuma, right? And then this is post Zuma. These are real figures. Oh, that's amazing. Wow. There's some next level stuff. Come on. Yeah. Okay, we'll just see what this thing does. If it totally bails on us, then we will have to make some other plan. What I also went and got was data from the World Bank. So here's South African GDP. Now this is not real GDP, this is nominal GDP. So you can see our nominal GDP growth looks pretty impressive. Compare that to our real GDP growth. You can see inflation has an effect on that trajectory. Obviously, this big drop over here is also far more accentuated. Right? This is in current US dollars as well. So what this is demonstrating is also the depreciation of the rand in recent years. So in US dollars terms, our economy has done, or went through a big dip in US dollar terms. In US dollar terms, it has not recovered to where it was previously. Despite our real GDP increasing, in US dollar terms, it has not. Yeah, so that's what our GDP looks like. Any questions on that? Yeah.
The decline in 2008, wasn't that for the financial crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. So this dip over here, that's financial crisis, right? What happens at the same time is we have a change in leadership, and you can see we recover from that crisis. In other words, as the rest of the world recovers, so do we. And then what you see after that is this slowdown in growth. So let me just check if I saved another one. I meant to save, and I see I didn't actually save it here. I meant to save the most recent quarterly economic review from the Reserve Bank, which shows you what our GDP growth rate has looked like over the last year. And it's just kind of declining. Right? So this is, at the moment, it's sitting at it's sitting at kind of like a straight line because our growth is sitting at basically zero. So the concern is that it is going to start going down. I'm not sure if that will happen, but Yeah, we'll see. It depends. If Molefe gets into the treasury and there's a big nuclear deal that goes through and opposition parties are able to hold that nuclear deal up in the courts for the next 15 years, we should be okay. If they can't, then expect trouble, is the way I see it at any rate. Is it okay watching this thing? Was it kind of like a strobe light? Feels like a strobe light down here. Should I carry on? You guys happy if we just carry on for a while? Okay, if at any point it becomes unbearable, just let me know, and then I can go and get some chalk. Can work it out that way. Okay, how does GDP grow? This is exciting stuff. I know I might not sound very excited about it, but GDP growth is a really, really interesting topic. What determines potential GDP? Okay, so what determines the potential of our economy to produce output? The two primary factors, labor as well as capital. So one is labor. Now I see in this diagram it's shifted a little bit, which is a bit disappointing, but anyway. If we therefore plot labor against output, what kind of a relationship should we expect? Well, as we increase the amount of labor we employ, we expect the amount of GDP to be produced to increase. You happy with that? Do you expect it to be a linear relationship? Do you expect it to be a relationship that curves upwards, or do you expect it to be a relationship that curves downwards? And when I say what do you expect, what I mean by that is, based on your previous experience in microeconomics, which of these would you expect? Give me some feedback. In other words, we've got a diagram that's showing increasing at a decreasing rate. Why do you think that is so? Why is it increasing at a decreasing rate? Why not just a linear relationship? Yeah.
The more money and labor you add,
Yeah.
then at some point people can start slacking, and in return for the $80 rent you probably isn't as much as the first rent.
Okay. So in microeconomics, we discussed the concept diminishing marginal returns, right? As you add more and more of something into a production process, it becomes less and less effective at producing output. In other words, the output we expect to get from labor should be increasing, but increasing at a decreasing rate, right? Diminishing marginal returns. You happy with that idea? What we call this curve here is a production function. Production function, that's what the PF stands for. The amount of product per labor. So obviously, as we increase labor, we increase output. So our potential GDP grows. Labor as an input into that production function comes from a labor market. So we're going to talk a little bit about the labor market. Our labor market we derive from the same sort of principles that you discussed in microeconomics. The labor demand curve is downward sloping when we plot labor against real wage. In other words, the more that companies have to pay people, the higher the real wage, the less people they are prepared to employ. Alternatively, the lower real wage that companies have to pay, the more people they are prepared to employ. Does that relationship kind of sit easy with you? You happy with that idea? Okay. Labor supply, upward sloping. Why is it upward sloping? The higher the real wage, the more labor people are willing to supply to the market. You happy with that idea? Okay. Upward sloping labor supply, downward sloping labor demand. And at some point, these two curves intersect. That is our equilibrium, labor quantity, and equilibrium, real wage. this point of equilibrium, right, that quantity of labor is going to produce some level of output. Are you happy with that? We're going to take that level of labor as an input into a production function. It's going to produce some level of output. That level of output is called potential GDP. And what do we know about employment at potential GDP? What do we call it? We call that full employment. Full employment, in other words, this is the point where we are producing potential GDP. Okay? So if this quantity of labor here, 20, call it QFE for quantity at full employment. If we go to our previous graph, there's 20 here. That is our quantity of labor at full employment, QFE. That is going to produce some level of output. And that level of output is what we call potential GDP. Everyone happy with that? Questions? No? Okay. So here we've got those two diagrams next to each other. I prefer to plot this diagram above this diagram so that the quantity of labor on this diagram lines up with the quantity of labor in this diagram. But the question is, if we are at this potential level of GDP, so potential GDP at full employment, how do we increase potential GDP? In other words, how do we grow our economy? If we're just looking at the labor side of things, remember, what we need to do is to change this equilibrium level of employment. And how do we change that equilibrium level? Simple economic concepts here. We want equilibrium level of labor supplied, in other words, labor employed, sorry, not labor supplied, the equilibrium level of labor employed to increase. We can do that in one of two ways. Labor supply shifts to the right. If that happens, are you happy that equilibrium will be at a greater quantity of labor employed? Are you with me on that? Yeah? Are you happy that that would be a movement to the right? Not of the entire graph, just of, let's do this like this rather. Are you happy it would be a movement that way? Are you happy that a movement that way is the same as saying a movement up and along this curve? Are you happy with that? Are you happy that that would mean an increase in potential GDP? Yeah.
So you're saying if we decrease the real wage, then labor would obviously increase and then potential GDP would increase.
Okay, so I didn't start with decreasing the real wage. What I started with was increasing labor supply. If our labor supply increases, there will be downward pressure on real wages. Happy with that? So if labor supply increases, real wages will fall and there will be an increase in employment. But the increase in employment, right, didn't start with a fall in real wages. It started with an increase in labor supply. Okay? So we shift our labor supply curve to the right. Equilibrium occurs at, as you correctly observe, a lower real wage, a higher level of employment. Let's say that our employment, equilibrium employment is now 30, which means full employment is now 30. It's a movement up and along our production function. Are you happy then that, oh, come on, higher level of labor quantity employed corresponds to a higher level of potential GDP? Okay? That's easy. Now it's going to get a little bit more complicated. Actually, wait, it's just... Okay, so this was the shift in the labor supply curve. Drawn it over here. Talk, yeah?